Coming up, I'll talk about some important developments today. Steve Bannon out of prison. Jeff Bezos with a new statement about journalism and objectivity and our duties as citizens. 1 week out from the election. Conservative attorney Jenna Ellis, host of Jenna Ellis in the Morning, joins me. We're going to talk about never Trump Republicans, reluctant Republicans, and the 2024 election. Hey, if you're watching on Rumble or YouTube, listening on Apple, Google, or Spotify, please subscribe to my channel. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
America needs this voice. The times are crazy. In a time of confusion, division, and lies, we need a brave voice of reason, understanding, and truth. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
We are exactly 1 week. Well, a week from today, Election Day. And it's going to be a day full of anticipation, of excitement. I mean, if I think about my own feelings, they're a combination of exhilaration and foreboding. Because, well, all of us have a little bit of PTSD left over from 2020, and maybe even a little from 2022. So even though I'm feeling pretty good about this election, certainly compared to 4 years ago, I was telling Debbie this morning, I would just look to see there was a report about Kamala Harris pulling $2 million of ad buys out of North Carolina and to redeploy the money to Virginia. Well, that is a good indication because it means that Kamala Harris doesn't think she can win North Carolina. Now, Trump won North Carolina in 2020, but it was very close. And pulling out of a state is essentially an admission that you're not really going to compete there anymore. And the fact that she's redeploying to Virginia is also telling because, hey, Virginia is supposed to be a relatively safe bet for the Democrats. They can't win the presidency and lose Virginia. I'm not saying they're going to lose it, but the fact that it's in play is pretty telling. Now, I'll come back to the election and our responsibilities in this final week. But I want to talk about a couple of other interesting things in the news that are closely related. One, Steve Bannon is out of jail, and that is a great sign. He seems to be fired up. I mean, when I watched him coming out of the prison facility, his daughter was there to greet him. I mean, it was a little bit of a deja vu for me, not that my experience was identical, but Debbie reminded me, she's like, Dinesh, your case was sort of the first of all of this. Because think back, what cases are there before your case where there's selective prosecution, where there's going after someone primarily, I say primarily because the fact that they are a political dissident. In my case, of course, I'd made the film about Obama. And Bannon has come out of jail, of prison, with the same attitude that I did. In other words, he's come out basically saying, I'm not defeated, I'm not dejected, I'm fired up, I'm more determined than ever. And I listened to a little bit of Bannon on War Room this morning, and he was fiery. I mean, he was talking not just about the things that we need to do over the next 7 days, but also he was basically saying, get ready for the chaos that the Democrats will try to sow if Trump wins the election, as I think Bannon expects that he will. So welcome back to Steve Bannon, a very powerful voice on our side. And this was think about all the people now that have gone behind bars under the Biden-Harris administration. Think of all the conservatives, Peter Navarro, and even the people who haven't been jailed. Look at the way that they have gone after people like Giuliani, for example, trying to just absolutely destroy him, bankrupt him. A systematic campaign of trying to exterminate people's careers. They've gone after the Trump attorneys. They've gone after pro-lifers. They've gone after January 6th protesters. So this has become something of an epidemic. Debbie and I were talking on the way here. Debbie's like, well, I mean, how is it that people don't recognize that this is going on? And the problem, I think, for most people is that they look at the legal system and they think, well, these guys must have, they must have sort of transgressed the law in some way, not realizing that these transgressions they occur on the other side with no accountability at all. Oh, Steve Bannon defied a subpoena. Well, let's make a list of all the Democrats who've defied a subpoena and ask how many of them have found themselves behind bars. Well, Steve Bannon broke the law. Well, didn't Jamal Bowman break the law when he pulled the fire alarm? Has he been arrested? Has he been charged? No. So there is a pattern here, and that's, I think, what needs to be highlighted. Now, let me pivot from Steve Bannon to another interesting development at the Washington Post, and that is that finally the owner, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, has spoken up. And Jeff Bezos put out a statement, which some people are welcoming as a bold statement. I want to summarize the essence of the statement, and I don't think it's all that bold. I do think that it is a very important pushback against all these pompous Washington Post writers and editors who think it's some kind of moral duty. They're like, we have exposed the crimes of Donald Trump. The Washington Post needs to stand behind our reporting and endorse Kamala Harris. And basically what Jeff Bezos says is, we're not doing it. And he goes on to say that the journalistic profession is the least trusted profession now, just about in the world. I believe journalism has sunk below Congress in terms of public trust. People just don't believe. And now Jeff Bezos, after saying that, which is true, the problem, I think, with Bezos' rhetoric is he goes on to say, well, the problem here is not that we are biased, but rather that we are seen to be biased. In other words, the problem isn't that we are in fact left-wing. We are dominated by left-wingers. Pretty much all our columnists are left-wing. The only Republicans who are welcome at the Post are Republicans who bash Donald Trump and bash the Republican nominee. This is not really a legitimate newspaper. And it's not because of impressions. The point is that the impression of bias, the impression of corruption is based upon the reality of bias and the reality of corruption. So Bezos is trying to sort of have it both ways. He's saying, well, we've got some really fine journalists, and it's really kind of a pity that these people are not being trusted by the public. And if we endorse Kamala Harris, he's implying that it'll just give ammunition to those people not to trust us. The problem with this kind of stupidity, and I think it is in the end stupidity. I mean, I understand tactically why he's doing it. And frankly, even this soft statement by Jeff Bezos is provoking palpitations. All you have to do is go and read the comments below Jeff Bezos' statement to see the way that these people on the left are so deranged. They've been so propagandized. They believe in a sense their own, they've drunk the Kool-Aid, except that they think that the Kool-Aid is some kind of nirvana, some kind of enlightenment, something that's really opened their eyes. And they don't realize that they have basically become the ideological Jim Joneses of the modern world. So even a very kind of tactful, gentle statement by Bezos is sending them through the roof, so to speak. But it is not wrong for us to criticize Bezos and say, look, Jeff Bezos, you really want to fix the Washington Post, you need to adopt a model in which you have writers and columnists that really reflect the true philosophical and ideological diversity of the country. You need to hire a bunch of conservative writers, conservative columnists. You need to show that the variety of opinions that are held by the American people can be intelligently argued on both sides, and maybe not. There are more than two sides. There are libertarians. There are people who, in a sense, cut across ideological boundaries. You want to reflect that kind of genuine struggle of ideas. That is the lifeblood of a democracy. It's not simply having a free press. It is having a free press that reflects and refracts the opinions of the American people. Now, I don't think that this is what Jeff Bezos is going to do. I don't think that it's something that he's even really quite concerned about. There are some people who essentially argue that his motives are largely commercial. He has space projects, and he's worried that those will get defunded if Trump becomes the next president. He has monopolies, including the or favorable treatment for the Amazon Web Service, and he's a little worried that cozy arrangement may not continue to exist under a Trump administration. So I don't know what his motives are. I do think that it is a valuable thing that he has, because, there are so many of these Washington Post columnists who are like, we cannot obey in advance the directives of the autocrats. And they act as if the Washington Post refusing to endorse Kamala Harris is in fact an act of autocracy. It is in fact an act of obedience to Donald Trump. Well, think about it this way. If it's an act of obedience to Donald Trump for the Washington Post to do that, then it's an act of obedience to Donald Trump on your part for continuing to work at the Washington Post. If you truly believe that, Nazism is on the ballot, you should resign. You should quit. And I believe Jeff Bezos has thought about this in advance, and he's quite willing to have a lot of these parasites. I mean, the point is that the journalists at the Post are parasites. They can't fund themselves. They essentially require a patron or a host. The parasite depends on the host. The host doesn't really depend on the parasite. I think this is really why Bezos doesn't really care, because he knows that these people, they want social status. They want their paychecks. They're not willing to give them up. So they engage in this kind of lavish punditry, but at the end of the day, for them, it's more important to protect their paycheck. It's more important for them to protect their status. So they're not going anywhere. One or two of these guys have resigned. But think of it. There are hundreds of people who are screaming about Jeff Bezos' decision, and these hundreds of people have not, in fact, quit the Washington Post, which if they really believe if they really want to drink the Kool-Aid and stand behind the Kool-Aid, then they should be out of there. But they're not going to. Now, I also want to put in a word about the final stretch of this election and talk about the fact that there's really no excuse for sitting out the election. None at all. In fact, there's every reason for us to use all our influence to get everybody we know to get out there and vote. Be part of the process. Why? Because we don't live in a direct democracy. We're not consulted year-round, or over the next 2 or 4 years, the opinions of the American people are not going to matter all that much. Our elected representatives are going to be making all the decisions in our name and on our behalf. The point I'm trying to make is it's only every 2 years for Congress, only every 4 years for president, only every 6 years for the Senate that we even get a say. And our say is kind of limited. It's a sort of a veto power. We can say to the people who are in, we don't like the job you did, we're voting you out. We have choices on the ballot. It's this guy or that guy. And the point I want to make is that this is the limited leverage that we have in a representative democracy. So if we don't use it, we're essentially abdicating our right to be heard. We're basically saying what we think doesn't really matter. And in fact, our system of government doesn't really matter because the power that it extends to the citizens, this is the very meaning of self-government, the fact that we govern ourselves, but we govern ourselves not all the time, only periodically. You actually govern yourself only in the limited way that you govern your own life. You make your own choices, you take responsibility for yourself, but we govern our society intermittently, every 2 years, every 4 years. So this is our chance. If you don't like the way the country is going, now's the time to speak up, or as they say, hold your silence. There's a lot at stake in this upcoming election, but you know what? Regardless of who's sitting in the White House, the fuse on the economy has already been lit. 4 years of a conservative presidency won't really be enough to turn the tide on our $35 trillion national debt. And if the left wins, well, it's like throwing gas on a dumpster fire. Now, we don't totally control the election outcome, but you can diversify your savings now by investing in gold from Birch Gold, like Debbie and I have. For millennia, gold has stood firm in the face of greedy governments, economic upheavals, global strife, and it can help protect you now. Birch Gold, my gold company, will help you convert an IRA or 401k into an IRA in physical gold. And it won't cost you a penny out of pocket. In the past 4 years, the buying power of the US dollar has declined. The price of gold has increased 40%. Coincidence? I don't think so. Get started. Text Dinesh to 989898. You'll get a free information kit on gold. Trust Birch Gold as I do to protect your savings. Text Dinesh to 989898 today. We are officially in that time of year where eating becomes way off balanced. Parties, holidays, family gatherings, they mean more snacks, more sweets, generally indulging in all the wrong foods. And when your eating habits get off balance, so can you. That's why I strongly recommend this. It's Balance of Nature. It's the daily supplements, fruits and veggies in a capsule. These fruits and veggie supplements are sourced from whole fruit and vegetable ingredients, all the things you may be missing, all the things you need to make up for being off balance during the eating season. Make sure you're getting more of a variety of fruit and vegetable ingredients every step of the way with Balance of Nature. Start a trend toward better health today with my special startup offer. Whether you order online or call direct, you got to use promo code America and you'll get 35% off plus free shipping and a money-back guarantee. Here's the number to call, 800-246-8751. Again, it's 800-246-8751. Or go to balanceofnature.com. When you use discount code America, you get 35% off plus free shipping and a money-back guarantee. Guys, I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast my friend Jenna Ellis. She was senior legal advisor and personal counsel to the 45th President of the United States. She's also chairwoman of the Election Integrity Alliance Special. She's a Newsmax and Epoch Times contributor. She's host of Jenna Ellis in the Morning. You can follow her on X at Real Jenna Ellis. Jenna, welcome. Thank you very much for joining me. We are exactly 1 week out from a very important election, important not only for the presidency, but also for the fate of the House and of the Senate. As someone close to these developments, but also someone who observes them, comments on them, what is your take on where things are right now?
Yeah, Dinesh, thanks so much for having me, and it's great to see you again. And I so appreciate just your friendship and support through my personal journey as well over the last couple of years. And, isn't it crazy that America finds ourselves in this moment that we are on the brink, potentially of descending into a Marxist, socialist, what they would describe as a utopia on the left. And the polls currently a week out are so close. I mean, it should not be this close to have such a terrible candidate as Kamala. And I don't care what anyone thinks about Donald Trump personally, whether they like him or not. He at least stands for America and America first. It's not just a campaign slogan. I know from working for him personally, he genuinely cares about the best interests of this nation. And the fact that potentially someone like Kamala Harris, who will be even worse than Joe Biden, has a potential chance to win just tells you about the utter state of politics and culture in this society as well. And there was a recent Barna survey, I'm sure that you saw, that approximately 34 million American self-identified Christians who are regular churchgoers may actually sit out this election just because of the top of the ticket. And that is shocking to say that the state of the church is that we're not talking about these issues from the pulpit. I mean, in my home state of Florida, we have abortion, the most extreme abortion amendment in our state constitution is on the ballot that is right now within the margin of potentially passing. So my take on this is that we need to be more involved as Christians, as conservatives. We need to have more civic education, and we need to understand that the blessings of liberty really have an opportunity of not actually being there for our children and our grandchildren if we don't take this moment now to participate.
I mean, Jenna, the problem you're describing, I think, seems to have some pretty deep roots. And by that, I mean, I have been, attending conservative Christian churches and for a pretty long time. By and large, there seems to be a a reluctance to talk explicitly about political issues. There might be, one time in the year when the pastor goes in that direction, but it is an exception and not the rule. My question is, does this really need to change? Do pastors need to recognize that our Christian life and our civic life are connected, and that applying Christian principles and moral principles to the world we live in is not an abdication of what the pastor is supposed to do? In fact, that is his job or her job.
Oh, 100%. I mean, this is where the historically the role of the church was to influence culture and influence the family. I mean, the family is the first institution that God himself ordained in the book of Genesis. And then we have seen that Christ followers and Christians throughout world history have always been engaged to bear the standard of truth and of reflection of the reality to which God has presented us. And the fact that pastors and self-identified Christians are not taking this moment to stand up and engage on basic issues like the sanctity of human life, like men can't transition to become women. Men shouldn't play in women's sports. I mean, some of these things that genuinely are on the ballot because the people who represent us will be making the laws and policy. I mean, these are things that are just so basic. If we can't confront reality and we can't stand up for truth, then it's not just about this one election. It's about literally the future of this country and standing up for truth. And so my hope is that in this 1 week, more pastors, more Christians will take that so seriously to be engaged as the founders of our country did. I mean, they came to this nation for religious freedom, for the right to do what we're talking about right now, which is speaking together about truth and reality and exercising our first freedoms and engaging in self-government, which means that we have the opportunity to direct the outcome of this nation and continue to create a more perfect union, not go backwards.
I mean, there seem to be all kinds of reasons, Jenna, why people may, not want to vote. They're lazy. They don't see the significance of it. They get distracted by other pursuits. I think what really gets me, though, isn't that kind of lethargic reaction, which is somewhat understandable, but rather the people who think that they are abstaining out of high principle. In other words, the person who says something like, I am too good to vote. I'm not going to lower myself by voting for one of these two candidates. I don't like Kamala Harris, but I don't like Donald Trump either. Essentially, neither of them live up to my moral standards. Now, this is the kind of person who is sort of riding their moral high horse here. What would you say to such a person if they were sitting right here and they were like, Jenna, I'm just too wonderful of a person to lower myself into the voting booth?
Well, then I would say that they don't understand what America is founded upon and their moral obligation to engage in selecting and preferring their leaders. And the fact that so many people think that it's a matter of piety as a Christian to abstain, they're confusing an endorsement with their vote because it's always a closed universe situation. We only have the candidates or the issues that are on the ballot. I mean, even Donald Trump initially saying that he was in favor of Amendment 4 because he thinks that the heartbeat bill that Governor DeSantis signed, we should give them a little more time. That's not what's on the ballot. And thankfully, he recognized that and said, well, wait a minute, this is too extreme. I'm now against Amendment 4, and I commend him for that. That's the same kind of analysis that every Christian and voter should go through and say, well, wait a minute, I only have these options. And if I abstain, thinking that that's virtue signaling, then what I'm really doing is abdicating my decision-making and my country to those who will engage in this.
And you do have a small number. I don't think it's a large number, but there are some notable evangelicals. And there's even some sort of a group, evangelicals for Harris. Is there an evangelical case to be made for Harris, or is there, what's going on here? How would you account for the fact that you've got some people who have had, they've had some history in the church to be sure, and yet they are lining up behind a candidate that would seem to be the antithesis of Christian values, and not only that, but a candidate that would scold a group of people who talk about praising Jesus at one of her rallies. She instinctively goes, "You're at the wrong rally." So she doesn't want them, but they evidently want her.
Yeah, this whole idea of evangelicals for Harris, I think, is completely ignoring what the truth of Scripture says. And they're trying to virtue signal because they know, actually, that we are founded as a Judeo-Christian nation. And they understand that to be a Christian is actually a thing of virtue. So they're trying to take that proposition and to force it into this group that's called Evangelicals for Harris. That I've interacted with them on social media. They won't identify exactly who they are, and they will never address any of the moral issues, like where Kamala Harris actually stands on abortion. They won't address any of the truths of Scripture. They will take Scripture out of context and just try to use that as a political talking point. And so to suggest that there could be something like Evangelicals for Harris is like saying, vegans for hamburgers. I mean, it makes no logical sense, because if you look at what Kamala Harris's actual policy is, and she can read it on her own website if she actually wants to get up to speed and understand the policy. But if they look at what Kamala Harris's campaign actually stands for, and then they look at the truth of God and what the person of Jesus Christ actually stands for, those two things are mutually incompatible. So they're going to have to choose. And at the end of the day, they're going to choose the pagan Marxist socialism over the truth of Jesus Christ. And so that's a complete misnomer. There cannot be such a thing consistently, logically, and internally as a Christian that votes for the current Democrat Party. And you're seeing even people who don't necessarily identify as Christians, but do say they believe in God, like Robert Kennedy Jr. and even like Tulsi Gabbard, saying, I was a former Democrat and I can't support what the current party stands for. Those people are at least willing to be consistent, and I commend them for standing firm.
When we come back, I want to talk to Jenna Ellis about her own journey and where she is now politically. We'll be right back. Can you imagine your child being lost alone in the woods for 9 days? There's a new movie. It's called Lost on a Mountain in Maine. It's produced by Sylvester Stallone. It's the inspiring true story of 12-year-old Don Fendler, separated from his family in a fast-moving storm, lost in the remote wilderness of northern Maine. For 9 days, he fights to stay alive with no food, no proper clothing. He didn't even know the danger he was in. As a parent, this would be one of my worst nightmares. So his disappearance captured national headlines, sparking a massive search effort with hundreds of volunteers, including his own father, who was afraid he'd never see his son again. Don't miss the inspirational family adventure film of the year, Lost on a Mountain in Maine, from Blue Fox Entertainment, coming to theaters nationwide on November 1. Get tickets online at lostonamountaininmainemovie.com. That's lostonamountaininmainemovie.com. Mike Lindell is a heart of gold. Mike and MyPillow love giving back to those in need. They sent a truckload of 14,000 MyPillows to those impacted by Hurricane Helene. But even though he loves to give back, a large retail store just canceled a huge order that had already left the warehouse. So besides giving to those in need, Mike wants to pass some big savings directly on to you. For the first time ever, you can get a standard classic MyPillow for wholesale prices, only $14.88. But it gets better. For a limited time, they're offering their entire classic collection at wholesale prices. Get queen-size MyPillows, just $18.88. Upgrade to a king for only $1 more. Get the body pillows, $29.88. And multi-use MyPillows for just $9.88. Here's the number to call, 800-876-0227, or you can go to mypillow.com, use promo code Dinesh, and take advantage of wholesale pricing for the first time ever. On top of that, get free shipping on orders over $75. These deals have never been this low before. Again, call 800-876-0227 or go to mypillow.com, use promo code Dinesh, get the standard MyPillow for just $14.88, the lowest price ever. There are limited quantities at this price, and once they're gone, they're gone. I'm back with Jenna Ellis, host of Jenna Ellis in the Morning. Follow her on X at Real Jenna Ellis. Jenna, talk a little bit about your own journey of the past few years. I know there's been a lot of confusion and misunderstanding, I think, in some cases. Jenna was with Trump, then she was like against Trump. Is she back with Trump? Talk a little bit about the changes you've undergone, if at all, and where you are now.
Yeah, and Dinesh, I really appreciate that question because you're right. There has been so much, frankly, misinformation about who I am, what I stand for, and even the process and everything that's happened over the last several years. And the biggest thing I think that people need to understand is that every point in my life, I have stood for the truth. And so this is not about supporting or hating Donald Trump or about agreeing to testify against him out of some kind of personal animus or even agreeing to testify against him. What I agreed to was to simply tell the truth. And so many people, even people who currently still work for Donald Trump, also agreed to that. And so I think that we should all value the truth and we should all tell the truth, whether it's on TV or under oath. And so that's no different. I've always stood for the truth. In terms of supporting Donald Trump or not, his position on 100% loyalty is something that I have never agreed with, because as an American voter, what people need to understand is that at every moment in an election or on an issue, my standard is the truth of God. And as a Christian, I will always support or oppose a candidate or a policy or a statement that they make based on the truth and my Christian faith. So there have been moments, even when I worked for Trump, I disagreed with some of the things that he stood for, like leaning pro-LGBT, for example. I would be asked on media, well, what do you think about the Pride Coalition? And I would say, well, I'm part of the Evangelicals for Trump Coalition, and here's what I personally believe about these issues. So for me, I think that my track record has been very consistent, that I have always stood for truth. I've stood for conservative values and principles. And in the primary, I genuinely believed, and I still believe, that Governor Ron DeSantis would have been a better candidate for the 2024 election. And I think the polls wouldn't be even nearly as close as they currently are, but that's not where we're at. And so between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, is Donald Trump the better candidate? Absolutely. He's not a Marxist socialist communist. I don't care what CNN tries to say and calling him a Nazi or all of this other rhetoric. That's totally false and not true. So as a Christian, I am always going to exercise my vote and my voice to support truth. And that has been true even in all of the personal legal issues and other things that have made me, rather than commenting on the news, the subject of the news. And the one lesson that I think I've learned throughout this whole thing is, first and foremost, to trust God more fully sooner, because God has defended me through all of this. And as I've stood up for truth at every moment, he's honored that. And I'm very happy to be past all of that and still standing for the truth.
What do you think, Jenna? I mean, it seemed that when DeSantis first got into the campaign, he was running very close to, perhaps even with Trump. And then things changed. Was it the lawfare? Was it the indictments that you think tilted the balance in favor of Trump? Because I think looking back, it almost seems like DeSantis picked the wrong time to run, that his time perhaps would have been 2028. I just want you to reflect a little bit just on what do you think happened so that DeSantis essentially went into a little bit of a free fall? Trump became the presumptive candidate. Even DeSantis recognized that. What caused that to happen in your view?
Well, I think the governor said it the best himself, that the majority of the GOP base and the voters wanted to give Donald Trump a second shot. And he was the super incumbent. And, you can't fight that sentiment. And so, I mean, this is a process where voters get to select the primary candidate. And whether or not I or Governor DeSantis or anyone else agree with that choice, where we're at is that was the majority. I do think that all of the indictments, certainly the lawfare up in New York, played a huge part in it, because conservatives, by and large, and they should be against lawfare. We should be against all of the targeting from, the Harris administration and the Biden administration targeting Christians, conservatives, pro-life advocates. We've seen all of that going on. People don't want that anymore. And Donald Trump has been basically the face of a lot of that for the majority of the voters. And so I actually applaud Governor DeSantis for recognizing that and saying, okay, if that's what the voters want, then, fine, I'll go back and manage Florida and govern really well for the next 2 years until he goes on to something else. So, that's our system. And so, again, if you are a Christian, if you're a conservative, and if you are a voter in this country, recognize that we only have two options at the top of the ticket, but we also have a ton of other stuff on our ballot. Make sure that you're making your voice heard, vote your values, and your number one value should be truth.
We started out, Jenna, talking about about the fact that the election was alarmingly close. And close despite the fact that you've got just a terrible candidate, not just terrible in a personal sense. She doesn't seem to know what's really going on around her, but terrible also ideologically, very radical, very extreme in her positions. Now, why is that? Why is the election so close? Is it because we have a different electorate than we did in the Reagan era? Is it because the drumbeat of media propaganda is worse than ever? Is it because people don't see through Harris? They just see her as a kind of identity politics candidate. What do you think accounts for the fact that you've got this eerie closeness in an election that really shouldn't be close?
Honestly, Dinesh, I attribute that to both sides nominating the worst possible candidate because there are so many people on both sides that absolutely hate Donald Trump. And then they also hate Kamala Harris and everything and how incompetent she is and what she actually genuinely stands for. Not just her word salad, but the fact that she can't govern this country well. And so if you had a candidate from the Republican side that didn't have all of the other issues that Trump does, I think that candidate, if it was somebody like a Ron DeSantis, would be running away with this. But to the flip side, if it was a Democrat who was even just decent, even just potentially a little bit moderate, you would see that person likely running away with the election because of the sentiment against Donald Trump and just because he's so controversial. I mean, you can't escape that fact. So I think that it's unfortunate that we find ourselves in this position. And my hope is that we can get past all of the love or hate for the names on the ballot and we can focus on the worldview difference. That's what I've been focusing on radio for the last several months. Especially since Kamala Harris became the installed nominee, is to say, forget that this is Trump or Harris. Look at the worldview differences that these candidates actually stand for and ask yourself, what do you want in an America? Do you want to continue in the blessings of liberty, to have genuine freedom, capitalism, the ability for school choice, informed, parental consent and parental rights? I mean, all of these things that we hold dear, that's going to go out the door with Kamala Harris. The border, to me, is the number one voting issue. If we fundamentally change the composition of our country, and we have the Electoral College that now with the 2020 census that wouldn't even ask the question of citizens, and they have a representative non-citizens, then we are not just changing the representation in the United States House of Representatives, but ultimately we will be reshaping the Electoral College. And that is something that the Democrats are pursuing fundamentally because they want to rig the system and they want to change the rules of the game so that they can secure a win for the future. And Republicans need to stand up and say, that's not America, and we're going to vote our values. And it doesn't matter if the name at the top of the ticket is Trump. It matters that you're not voting for the name Kamala Harris.
I've seen a couple of people in social media make a point that complements what you just said, but they make it in a somewhat different way. This is a point made by the sort of Nicole Shanahans of the world and some others. She was the kind of VP choice for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And what she says is, look, I'm not really voting for Trump, I'm voting for a team. In other words, there's a Democratic team, and we kind of know who's on that team. And they have some former Republicans on their team. But the Trump team is a team that includes not just J.D. Vance, but it now includes people like Tulsi Gabbard. It includes Elon Musk. It includes Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And so this is a quite diverse and competent and, in fact, quite an ideologically remarkable coalition that is united on the fact that the country itself is at the precipice. And there need to be dramatic changes in the border, but dramatic changes in the food we eat, dramatic changes in the way that we look at U.S. intervention abroad. What do you think of this idea of being on board with a very cool team?
Yeah, well, I would say to the leftists, I mean, isn't diversity what they value? And so the team Trump is way more diverse ideologically and politically and and almost every other way than the Kamala Harris team. And so isn't that something that they value? But the point is, that as America, we do have diversity, but it's not actually that diversity is our strength. It's that unanimity over a core mandate is our strength. And that's the Declaration of Independence, to say we recognize in the principle of limited power and separation of powers. And as the late, great Justice Scalia very famously said in front of the House Judiciary Committee when he was talking about the role of the judiciary, he was saying, even every kind of banana republic has a Bill of Rights and they have things that they'll protect. But if you don't separate and limit powers, then you will have a tyrannical government that will run away with whatever its ideology is based on. And that's what the left wants to do. They want more and more concentrated power in the federal government. And we need to come back to the principle diversity isn't our strength, unanimously affirming the Declaration's mandate that our country was built upon, that the left wants to erase. That is our central mandate, and that's our strength.
I mean, I want to highlight this last point you made, Jenna, because this is critically important. The Soviet Constitution protected all kinds of rights. The Chinese Constitution does. In the French Revolution, they were for this and they were for that, but those things weren't really being implemented. I think Scalia's point, which you're stressing here, is it isn't just enumerating a set of rights. We have a right to this and a right to that. It is structuring the government in such a way that you not only have limited government and limited powers, but then you have checks and balances so one branch of government can look over the shoulder of another. And ultimately, it is that way of structuring the government. I think it might have been Hamilton who said this originally, that the Constitution is a Bill of Rights. In other words, the Constitution is structured in such a way that your rights are protected because government is not given the power to take away this and take away that. And that's the point I think that you are making at the end. Guys, I've been talking to Jenna Ellis, host of Jenna Ellis in the Morning. Follow her on X at Real Jenna Ellis. Jenna, hey, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you, Dinesh. I appreciate it so much. And thank you again for your friendship and for always standing on the truth. And I can only hope that Americans will stand on truth this election.
Absolutely. Are you feeling overwhelmed by the increasing cost of health insurance? Have you had enough of not having control over your healthcare dollars? Introducing Share Right. It's healthcare done the right way. At Share Right, you're not just a number, you're part of a caring community. Forget about paying excessive premiums. With Share Right, you stand to save 30 to 50% compared to health insurance. So think about what you could do with all those savings. But it's more than just savings. Share Right ensures you have access to the care you deserve precisely when you need it, from routine checkups to unexpected emergencies. With Share Right, your healthcare is their top priority. Empower yourself today by taking control of your healthcare costs. Visit shareright.org/Dinesh to learn more. See how much you can save. Visit shareright.org/Dinesh. That's shareright.org/Dinesh for healthcare done the right way. My book, The Big Lie, which came out a few years ago, is now out in paperback. In fact, I've got the paperback right here. Very cool. And it's got a new introduction by me, and it's available through Amazon. I actually recommended that you get it because it's a good way to follow along and to also read and ponder this very fundamental question of fascism, its kind of allied term, Nazism, what these things mean, what they have meant, what they mean now. To look at the relevance of all this, I'm going to go beyond the rather juvenile accusation that the Madison Square Garden rally by Trump was some kind of a Nazi spectacle. You can hear this people with a very grave face say this on MSNBC as if it resembled reality. But of course, for people watching the rally, they can recognize that this is all nonsense and that your whole case is relying upon, one, the historical fact that there was a rally in 1939. But that alone proves nothing because lots of democratic events, not to mention other types of events, musical events, sporting events, and so on have been held at Madison Square Garden. Muhammad Ali fought at Madison Square Garden. Jimmy Carter, the Clintons have had events there. So having an event at Madison Square Garden hardly creates the atmosphere or milieu of a Nazi rally. Neither does making a joke about Puerto Ricans. Look, you can debate the wisdom of having a rather edgy comedian out there, but if you watch this guy makes jokes all over the place. He's really out there, and he's actually really funny. Now, this particular joke, as it turns out, didn't go over all that well. You could actually hear some groans in the audience. So this is not a joke that like MAGA was down with, not at all. And in fact, the comedian even responds to that. He goes something like, okay, you want me to go somewhere else? Fine. And he goes into a different kind of bit. So in any event, that is all quite shallow. But there's a lot more that you see out there of this nature. And I'm now looking at a post on social media which is talking about fascists and socialists. And it goes on to make a few points that I want to highlight, because this is the kind of viewpoint that I'm arguing against. This is the kind of thing we're going to examine in some detail in The Big Lie. So the guy starts by talking about the fact that the Nazis were, in fact, he says, National Socialists. And he says, but that doesn't really mean a lot. Why not? He says, well, combining the terms national and socialism was briefly popular across Europe in the 1920s. But these movements tended to be interested in creating social solidarity based not on class, but on race or ethnicity or nationality. So he's saying, there were all these groups that wanted to create this kind of social unification, but socialism has always wanted to do it based on class. These people wanted to do it based upon race or ethnicity, but somehow they nevertheless appropriated the socialist label. It's almost like saying that the term socialism was kind of a misnomer. He goes on to say, socialism in this context bears no relationship to the term in its present one. And then he goes on to say, he says, hey, so what if the Nazis called themselves National Socialists? He says, the North Koreans and the East Germans called themselves democracies. He goes, but just putting Democrat in your name, the Democratic Republic of North Korea or the Democratic Republic of East Germany, doesn't make you democratic. And so this is the kind of, I would say, this is the kind of talk that you're going to get in left-wing universities, in seminar rooms, in media outlets like CNN and MSNBC. And then the argument proceeds. He goes on to say, he says, here's what Hitler did once he was in power. He busted up unions, privatized certain industries, dismantled social welfare programs, outlawed socialist parties and organizations, and rounded up and executed people on the left before he did the same to Jews. Now, there is a good deal of truth in all this, but we are going to see, and as we go into the argument, recognize how all of this can be true on the face of it and yet highly deceptive. I mean, to give you an example, what happens with a lot of socialist parties is that they begin as gangs. Think of Lenin, for example. He begins as a leader of the Bolsheviks. And there are other communist parties, the Mensheviks, and there's Trotsky, and so on. Now, one could make the same point about Lenin as is being made here about Hitler. Once Lenin comes to power, he doesn't want to have any rivals. So what does he do? He outlaws all the other socialist parties. He takes all these gangs and he says, I don't need the gangs anymore because I now control the state. In other words, what's happening here with Hitler, it's no different than what happened with Mao. It's no different than what happened with Lenin, is that they are transferring the power from the movements on the street to the state itself. And they're creating a new socialist structure that is not grassroots, as the Bolsheviks originally were. The Bolsheviks originally were this ragtag band of professors and students and revolutionaries and soldiers, and this was a kind of mob on the street. But once it took hold of the state, it was no longer a mob. In fact, it outlawed mobs. It wanted the only mob to be the Russian military itself. And this is pretty much the exact same path that Hitler is taking. And that is, he's transferring the power from the brown shirts on the street to the military. He now doesn't want to have brown shirts because, in fact, the leader of the brown shirts, as we'll see, becomes a rival to Hitler himself. I'm going to continue here. Hitler's involvement in the economy was consistent with the principles of fascism. The means of production were not seized, but the party maintained a more direct role in some regulatory aspects. Hitler argued that both social-economic hierarchies and inequalities were good for the country. How socialist of him. Now, this is intended to be, by the way, sarcastic, but what I want to point out is that Lenin did exactly the same thing. Lenin, in other words, introduced complete socialism. Then he realized that the Soviet economy was crashing, and so he introduced what was called the NEP. The NEP was the new economic policy. What's the new economic policy? Capitalism. Lenin said, we sometimes have to go one step back. We go 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so Lenin argues in exactly the same mode as Hitler that we need to have a sort of a hybrid between socialist theories and some accommodation with consumer choice and with the market. So when this guy says how socialist of him, socialism in practice has always involved these kinds of adjustments and these kinds of accommodations. The difference, as we'll see, between fascism and socialism is that by and large, the communist socialists wanted the power to ultimately stay with the government. No genuine private sector. And for most of the time in Soviet Russia, there really wasn't a functioning private sector except in the black market. Now, Nazism and fascism from the beginning wanted to have an alliance between industry and government, but it's not an equal alliance. It's not like let's have a kind of mixture of the government and the private sector. No. There is a senior partner and a junior partner. The state is going to direct the private sector as to what to do. The state is going to tell the private sector, we want you to stop making cars and start making tanks. We want you to stop doing this and to start doing that. We will set the terms in which you do the things that you do. And of course, there's an implication here that somehow Hitler undermined the German welfare state. Nothing could be further from the truth. The welfare state under Nazism was much bigger than it had been before. It became a kind of a racial welfare state in a manner that I'll describe as we really dive into the book. So I haven't really gotten off the ground, but my purpose for analyzing this post, this rather detailed post on social media, is to show you that this is the kind of stuff that the left is putting out to students, to young people, and to people who don't know a whole lot about these issues. Because if you just were to read something like this, you'd be like, oh, wow, this is really very interesting. Yeah, just because they called themselves socialists doesn't make them socialists. And it looks like Hitler was actually against some of these socialist parties. So there is the point I'm trying to make here is that this is misleading, but it's misleading in a pretty subtle and intelligent way. In other words, what I'm getting at is there's been a whole superstructure of a whole rival way of thinking about fascism and Nazism that has been developed over 75 years. It goes right back to the end of World War II. The left has really devoted some effort and thought into all this. So the purpose of a book like The Big Lie isn't just to debunk one thing and say, hey, wait a minute, the Madison Square Garden rally wasn't really a Nazi spectacle at all. It's really to show you, it's the anatomy of the way in which a term like fascism or like Nazism is deeply manipulated by twisting it into a rival set of facts that are plausible on the surface, but that upon scrutiny are deeply misleading. Ultimately, what's going on here is that the left is engaging in a very elaborate scheme to cover its own tracks. And the value of this book is and I think in some ways for the first time, because there's no book of its kind, it just lifts the veil so you can now look at the way in which the truth has been distorted and come to learn about it for yourself.
Subscribe to the Dinesh D'Souza podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify, or watch on Rumble, YouTube, and salemnow.com.